Following his victory at the Battle of Dyrrachium, Pompeius Magnus, who did not immediately pursue Caesar, felt the civil war was effectively won. Knowing that Caesar was short of both funds and supplies, Pompeius expected Caesar's army to fall apart, which often happened after a general lost a battle, and the morale of his men was low. Dispatches were sent to many of Pompeius's eastern client kings, informing them that the civil war was all but over. Many of the senators within Pompeius's retinue began discussions amongst themselves over which of them would hold the consulships, and even who would become the next Pontifex Maximus, and claim the state-owned home of Julius Caesar. But since the office of Pontifex Maximus was a lifelong position, the election of a new high priest of the Roman Empire would only be permitted upon Caesar's death. Pompeius, however, had no more desire to fight. He was confident that by closing off Caesar's access to grain supplies, the Pompeians could precipitate the dissipation of Caesar's forces by starving their enemy, a tactic known as the Fabian strategy. Marcus Porcius Cato, in spite of his passion for vengeance against Caesar, agreed with Pompeius. After having personally witnessed the number of Roman corpses filling the trenches at Dyrrachium, Cato wept, wishing to spare his countrymen any further bloodshed. But Pompeius's generals were not satisfied with waiting for Caesar's army to fall apart. Lucius Afranius, one of the generals Caesar had pardoned at Ilerda, on condition that he did not take up arms against Caesar again, hurried to Greece following his pardon, and realigned himself with the cause of Pompeius Magnus. Afranius, together with another of Pompeius's commanders, a man named Marcus Favonius, sought to shame Pompeius for his decision to avoid battle. They taunted Pompeius by referring to him as King Agamemnon, who in the legend of Troy, had selfishly refused to lay aside his sole authority. Favonius bewailed his inability to relax and enjoy the sweet and succulent figs of Tusculum merely because Pompeius Magnus loved being in command, and was basking in the importance of having so many generals subject to him. Unnerved by the humiliating innuendos, Pompeius reluctantly pulled up camp. Leaving Marcus Porcius Cato in command of Dyrrachium, Pompeius began his pursuit of Caesar, who was marching for Thessaly, intending to join up with the two legions under the command of Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus. Pompeius marched along the Via Egnatia, hoping to relieve his father-in-law, Metellus Scipio, before the arrival of Caesar's forces. As both Pompeius and Caesar were closing in on the location of Calvinus and Scipio, several members of Caesar's Gallic cavalry who had defected to the side of Pompeius, once again changed their minds. Abandoning Pompeius's camp, they charged ahead in order to warn Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus of Pompeius Magnus's imminent arrival, and of Caesar's approximate location. Withdrawing, Calvinus marched his two legions to meet those of Caesar. With his army fully united, Caesar needed to secure his grain supplies. However, at the behest of Pompeius, word spread quickly of Caesar's defeat at Dyrrachium, and the cities in Thessaly closed their gates to him, refusing to augment Caesar's dwindling food supplies. Thessaly's praetor, a man named Androsthenes, issued orders to all citizens, free and slave, situating them within the walls of Gomphi, a large town on the road from Epirus to Thessaly, which was full of much-needed resources. Androsthenes sent communications to Pompeius Magnus requesting his immediate aid, warning that Gomphi could stand against Caesar only a short time, and was unable to endure a lengthy siege. But Caesar immediately laid siege to Gomphi, commanding his men to take the town swiftly. Gomphi was replete with grain supplies Caesar's army desperately needed, and if they succeeded in seizing the town before Pompeius arrived, Caesar knew the other towns would be frightened into submission. Although Caesar, following the crossing of the Rubicon, had shown clemency to the various towns he'd secured in Italy, he did not offer Gomphi the same mercy. Once the town, unable to withstand even a short siege, fell, Caesar allowed his men to exact his retribution against Gomphi. Men were killed, women assaulted, children taken for slaves, and houses and temples were plundered. Androsthenes, along with approximately 19 other city magistrates, committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of Caesar. The following day, Caesar's legions stumbled drunkenly from Gomphi, dragging prisoners with them, as they moved towards the next town. Metropolis was initially prepared to withstand a siege until Caesar paraded Gomphi's prisoners before the city walls. Metropolis surrendered, and opened its gates to Caesar's men, as did several other towns in the area. Although Caesar's army was temporarily resupplied, Pompeius Magnus still considered the Fabian strategy the best choice, knowing that Thessaly, like Epirus, would quickly run out of resources. All Pompeius had to do was shadow Caesar's legions, and prevent his forces from leaving Thessaly. But his commanders, and those senators in his company, suddenly nervous that Caesar was regaining his strength, demanded Pompeius take up battle, and finish Caesar once and for all. Caving to the pressure, Pompeius Magnus marched his army toward Pharsalus, which was the very next town on Caesar's path. With over 45,000 infantry and approximately 7,000 cavalry, the Pompeians, supremely confident, encamped on the high ground. Caesar arrived with approximately 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, equally confident. Caesar's legions were the veterans of a decade's worth of battles in Gaul, whereas Pompeius's legions were mostly new recruits who had only seen a single battle. Cicero, who was present in Pompeius's camp, also informs us that Pompeius's camp was rife with disorganization and miscommunication, due to the multitude of languages and fighting styles of his many eastern allies. For several days the armies faced one another. Caesar would march his forces out and proffer battle, but Pompeius would refuse. Knowing he could not take Pompeius while he held the high ground, Caesar prepared to withdraw his men from the area, forcing Pompeius to follow him, and enlarging Caesar's opportunity to engineer for himself a more favorable position. But as Caesar's men were striking their tents, Pompeius suddenly marched his army onto the field, and offered battle. Pompeius placed Metellus Scipio in command of his 2 Syrian legions at the center, Lucius Domitius Enobarbus on his right flank, alongside the river, and Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Crus commanded the left flank, alongside Pompeius Magnus. Titus Labienus commanded Pompeius's powerful cavalry, and Pompeius's son, Sextus, along with Lucius Afranius, held 2 reserve legions in camp. Caesar matched Pompeius's setup, placing Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus in the center, with the 11th and 12th legions. Marcus Antonius took Caesar's left flank with a combination of the 8th and 9th legions, and Caesar placed his 10th legion on his right flank, under the command of Publius Cornelius Sulla, where Caesar also positioned himself. At Caesar's command, his first 2 lines charged, his third line remaining in place, with orders not to engage. Behind his stationary third line, Caesar had positioned approximately 3,000 infantry armed with spears, who awaited as a surprise unit. As Caesar's men charged across the chasm between the 2 armies, Pompeius's men remained still, choosing instead to hold their positions. Realizing that they would be exhausted by the time they reached Pompeius's line, Caesar's infantry stopped, regrouped, and then walked the distance between the 2 armies. Once they were nearing the Pompeian front lines, they renewed their charge. With Pompeius's defense holding firm against the charge of Caesar's infantry, Pompeius ordered Titus Labienus and his cavalry to bear down on Caesar's right flank, where Caesar was positioned alongside Sulla. Caesar's meager cavalry force responded by engaging Labienus, but against 7,000 horses, Caesar's inferior numbers could do nothing but slow their progress. As Titus Labienus focused on Caesar's cavalry, pushing them back towards the Caesarian lines, Caesar ordered his secret unit of spearmen to take up position behind his right flank. As the Pompeian cavalry came around Caesar's right flank, preparing to attack him from behind, they ran into a wall of spears. In such a cramped setting, the Pompeian cavalry soldiers were no match for Caesar's veteran infantrymen armed with spears, and were forced to withdraw in an attempt to regroup. Pompeius Magnus, upon seeing Titus Labienus's forces scatter, turned without a word and went back to camp. After Labienus's cavalry withdrew, Caesar's spearmen charged forward, outflanking the Pompeian left, which was under the command of Lentulus Crus. Of the 2 legions under Lentulus's command, one was the legion that had been taken from Caesar for the defense of Syria, and then slyly given to Pompeius Magnus by the Senate. considering Caesar had paid each man handsomely before dismissing them from Gaul, and had gifted each soldier a Gallic slave as a bonus. It seems very likely that, as Lentulus's forces began to crumble under the two-sided attack, some of those men who had initially belonged to Caesar, hoping it might buy them their lives, may have turned on the Pompeian brothers in arms, helping the Pompeian left flank to crumble that much faster. With Pompeius's left flank struggling, Caesar ordered his final, third line to charge. Lentulus Crus was nearly overwhelmed by Caesar's forces, and had no choice but to turn and run. With Titus Labienus withdrawn, and Lentulus Crus fleeing the battlefield, Pompeius's entire defensive line began to collapse. Most of the Pompeian army turned tail behind their commanders. Pressing up the hill and into Pompeius's camp, Caesar's armies attacked the reserve legions that had been left under the command of Sextus Pompeius and Lucius Afranius. Pompeius Magnus and his son, Sextus Pompeius, donning disguises, slipped quietly out of camp before Caesar's forces arrived. Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Crus, Metellus Scipio, and Titus Labienus all successfully escaped the carnage of Pharsalus, even as their men lay dying. Lucius Domitius Enobarbus, Caesar's longtime nemesis, unable to escape, was cut down by Marcus Antonius as he attempted to desert the battlefield. As approximately 25,000 of Pompeius's soldiers surrendered to Caesar, doubling the size of his army, Pompeius Magnus was making his way to the island of Lesbos, where he had sent his wife, Cornelia, to keep her safe. As the rest of the Pompeian commanders made their way towards Africa, where they could continue the fight against Caesar, Pompeius journeyed towards Syria, confident that he could, once again, depend upon his eastern client kings to raise to life for him a new army. The Battle of Pharsalus, which was fought on the 9th day of Sextilis, just 1 month after the Battle of Dyrrachium, saw Gaius Julius Caesar the victor of the very battle which the politicians and lesser generals had forced upon their commander, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. With the size of his army suddenly doubled, the Roman Empire now belonged to Caesar.